as a volunteer. Ali will speak for about 30 minutes, and that will be followed by a question and answer and discussion session. So everyone should now mute and then unmute if you will have questions.
Okay. Thank you for joining me in this discussion. I'm always thankful for opportunities to talk about this cause that I care about, and also I always enjoy opportunities to participate in your community. So thank you for that as well. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. I put a fireplace because this is a fireside chat, and I even figured out how to make it moving, and that was a bit of a challenge, but I figured that out. So like Phyllis said, I am a senior, and this year has been the year that my friends have started getting married, which is very exciting and hopeful and always very beautiful. And I totally believe that they are going to be supported and content in those relationships for the rest of their lives. And I'm sure that you felt that way about your daughters or nieces or friends. And you never think that this daughter or friend will be unable to remarry or have children, or God forbid, be financially extorted. But unfortunately, it's really all too common. So as we can see, the Bar Ilan's Rachman Center, which is the law school center for the advancement of women's status, did a poll, and they found that in Israel, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 5 women in Israel getting a divorce are refused a get. They're refused a divorce. 1 in 5 of these women reported that of all the stressors in their divorce, the fear of being refused a divorce was the greatest. And this number among religious and ultra-Orthodox women is as high as 1 in 4. And 1 in 3 of the women polled reported that she had been subject to threats of withholding a get or withholding a divorce. So we can see that this is really much more common than even I had realized. Okay, so did oh, maybe I'm just hearing some background noise. Okay, I know a little bit about this issue because I interned this summer for one of the leading Israeli organizations who are combating this issue. I'm going to speak about them a little bit more soon. I became interested in it because it combines my interests in healthy relationships with halakha and with applying halakha to meet contemporary need while maintaining the halakhic integrity was a combination that really interested me. So I am by no means an expert, but I did learn a little bit more about this issue while I was working over the summer, and I want to share with you what I learned about the issue and about the organizations who are working to combat it, as well as what they're doing. So these are 2 screenshots from my work over the summer, and I'll explain a little bit more about these articles later on. So the organization that I worked for is called Mavoi Satum, which translates to something like dead end, colloquially, or literally like a closed courtyard. They are a Jerusalem-based nonprofit who provide legal representation and psychological support to agunot and masoravot get, who are women who are refused a get or refused a divorce, as well as advocate for creative halachic solutions and legal solutions. So they are really operating within the halachic system and the Israeli legal system and kind of contemporary Israeli society and Israeli values and interests. And I want to talk about all of those factors and explain more about what the organizations are doing. Organizations including Mavoi Satum as one of roughly like the 3 leading Israeli organizations who are combating the issue. So first, a little bit of halachic background. So Jewish divorce, which assumes a marriage between a man and a woman, requires the husband to give his wife a get, which is literally like a written document, and she has to accept this document, and that like constitutes the divorce. Like I said, this is literally like a written document, and this document must be given willingly, which is really the root of a lot of the challenges that we'll see a little bit later. And until the husband has willingly given this document and the wife has willingly accepted it, the couple are still considered married, halachically married to each other. and any future children that the wife has are considered mamzerim, which is a particular halachic status of a person who has like limits on the way that they can participate and interact with Jewish people as a whole. So a woman who is in this situation where her husband is refusing to give her a get she is misarevet get, or called an aguna. And the term aguna has certain historical connotations, or had different kind of historical meaning, but today they're pretty much used interchangeably. And the problems arise in the halachic imbalance of the ramifications for still being married. So like I said, the husband has to give the get, but the wife also has to accept the get. So in theory, and this does happen, a woman could refuse to accept the get and the couple would still be married. But the problem, so in theory, they can both kind of equally prevent the divorce from happening. But the problem is that the ramifications for a woman to still be married are significantly more restrictive than for a man to still be married to his wife. So that's where the problems come in. So we hear much more about a husband refusing to give his wife a get, both because I think it's more common, but also because the ramifications on her, the halachic limitations of what she can then continue to do, are significantly greater. So why do these cases happen where a husband refuses to give his wife a get? So the first reason is evil. So these are the cases that you hear about in the news of a person who, lives his life in jail because he doesn't want to give his wife a get, and 30 years who refuse to give a get. So that can happen. This does happen. I think these cases are the ones that make big news and are kind of sensationalized, but they are less common. Then most of the time what happens is just that a divorce gets messy and the get becomes one bargaining tool to blackmail for a better financial agreement. So those are most of the cases that Mavoi Satum and the other organizations who combat the issue are looking at. And in those cases, what's complicated is that it's totally possible that the financial agreement that the husband is requesting is one in which he's entitled to. It's not necessarily the case that he's wrong about what financial arrangement he's owed. The problem is the use of this unfair bargaining tool. It's kind of the blackmail involved is the problem in those cases. And that's mostly what happens, is just a messy divorce and use of the get as a blackmailing tool. And because of the imbalance and halachic ramifications of what happens if the couple stays married, the wife is really put in a really bad situation if she can't access the get. Okay, so the way this plays out today, and that this is what organizations like Mavoi Satum are doing, is operating within the Beit Din. So when the Beit Din in Israel, the rabbinical court, is in charge of navigating divorce as well as marriage and conversion, which are some other places that you may have heard of issues or public debate about how the Beit Din functions. In a case where a couple comes to the Beit Din and the husband is refusing to give a get, there are a couple of strategies that the Beit Din can use. So the first is to apply sanctions to the husband to encourage him to give the get. So again, because the get has to be given willingly, the sanctions can't cross a line into coercion. They have to just be encouragement. And if that strikes you as kind of a fine line and maybe kind of an arbitrary line, it is there's a lot of rabbinic kind of fancy footwork to kind of figure out what's coercion and what's encouragement. But the idea is that the sanctions encourage the giving of the get, but don't coerce the giving of the get if they're used in the proper circumstances. And the reality is that when sanctions are applied, it usually works. Most of the time when the Beit Din agrees to give sanctions, the husband ultimately does give the get. The problem is, well, we'll talk about this in a moment. So that's the first strategy, is sanctions. The second strategy, which is less common, is that the Beit Din can find a flaw in the original marriage ceremony such that the marriage was never legitimate to begin with and the couple was never married. So at this point, when she's looking for a get, they would say, if they can find a flaw in the marriage was never valid. So she doesn't need the get because the marriage was never valid to begin with. And that's called bitul kiddushin. That is less common, and the B'tei Din are usually hesitant to use that strategy if they can avoid it. But, oh, and you may have heard of the Morgenstern and Rachman Beit Din in America was doing a lot of these bitul kiddushin or marriage nullification cases. Their reasoning was that if the woman had known that her husband was like crazy or evil in this way that he was going to withhold the get, then she wouldn't have married him. And so by not letting her know that he had this like evil tendency, he was concealing information such that the contract is not valid. And they've freed like 300 agunot through that strategy. That particular court is not accepted by most mainstream Orthodox organizations, but it is being done and makes a lot of news in the Orthodox world. So maybe you would have heard of the Morgenstern-Rachman court. But the general idea is nullifying the original marriage contract. So those are the two strategies that are used. The problem really is that the Beit Din will usually not do either of them. And this is the biggest problem, is motivating the Beit Din to get involved in a case of get refusal. Once they get involved, it's usually effective. It's just that most of the time they're very hesitant to get involved, and they will usually just send the couple to come to a financial agreement on their own, even if there's blackmail being used in their discussions about the financial agreement. Okay, so why they won't get involved is kind of a question, because they do have these strategies and they most of the time will not use them. So the first reason of why they don't want to apply sanctions or look for a condition to nullify the marriage is concerned with legitimate application of halacha. So if sanctions are applied in a case when it was not appropriate to do so, and a get is given under those sanctions, and two people think they're no longer married, they could say that the get was actually coerced and the get did not actually divorce the couple, and they're living their lives thinking that they're not divorced, but thinking that they're no longer married, but they actually still are. So that's why the Beit Din can be hesitant sometimes to interject if they think that applying sanctions would not be legitimate use of the sanctions, that the case is not one of the cases in which you can do that. So that's the generous read of why they don't get involved. The non-generous read, and what all of my supervisors repeatedly told me over the summer, is that it comes down much more to misogyny, political alliances, who wants what at what moment, power plays, this not being relevant to you and your particular family, is the other reason. So this is where Mavoi Satum and similar organizations step in. This is their role, is to convince the Beit Din that issuing a ruling to apply sanctions would be appropriate. And the way that they do this is appealing to halachic precedent and court ruling precedent. So the Mishnah in Ketubot outlines cases in which you can compel a get. So the cases in which you can apply pressure to give a get, and it's not considered coercion. So the implication is that if you apply pressure in other cases, it would be considered coercion and the get would not work. It wouldn't actually end the marriage. But in these cases, you can apply coercion, you can apply pressure, and it's not coercion. So a get given under pressure is okay, and it works. So there are certain cases, they're very limited. It's something like illness and the husband's job is smelly, so no woman would want to be married to him, and so we can let her out of it. Those are the cases in the Mishnah. So then the Talmud and later rabbis, what they do is they expand these limited cases to more cases that they think are similar enough that the same reasoning can be applied. So the idea being that if this case is similar enough to the original case listed in the Mishnah, then also it would be legitimate to apply pressure to give the get in this other case, and a get given in those circumstances would be legitimate and it would actually end the marriage. So in the past, it's actually kind of interesting. Abuse is not one of the undisputed cases in the Mishnah. Only in the past 20 years or so has that been widely accepted as being similar enough to the original cases that we can consider a get that is encouraged under sanctions in cases of abuse to be legitimate and actually end the marriage. So in cases of marital breakdown, it's more difficult to make an argument that that a get under sanctions works, because the fear is that if you apply sanctions in a case where it's not halachically legitimate to apply sanctions, and the get is coerced, not given willingly, and it doesn't actually end the marriage. But there is, over the course of rabbinic history, rabbis are constantly debating which cases you can apply pressure and have it still be halachically legitimate and which cases you can't. So what Mavoi Satum is doing is they're relying on all the rabbinic sources who say that in certain cases of regular marital breakdown or the couple having been separated for a certain amount of time, that those are also cases in which it is legitimate to apply sanctions and apply pressure to give a get, and a get given under those sanctions is legitimate. For example, there's a category in the Talmud about the husband being repulsive to the woman, and that this is a circumstance in which it's appropriate to apply pressure and apply sanctions to give a get. So then there's all this debate where like the Rambam expands this category of he's repulsive unto me to include to be more expansive. So there are more cases in which you can use this reasoning to apply sanctions, whereas other rabbinic figures like limit this category. So that's kind of the debate that's happening. So you have Rabbeinu Yerucham, who is a prominent 14th century European rabbi, and he rules that a rabbinical court must intervene to end a marriage when a wife requests a divorce and the husband delays the divorce even though it's clear that they're not going to reconcile. And that ruling is widely used by organizations like Mavoi Satum when they're appealing to the Beit Din to apply sanctions. So when they're asked to make a ruling to apply sanctions, the Beit Din is being asked to rule in accordance with all this halachic precedent, like this category of he is repulsive unto me, or Rabbeinu Yerucham's ruling about not delaying a divorce, and they rely on court precedent. So there's all sorts of times when the high rabbinical court or the Beit Din Rabbani Gadol made rulings that suggested that you can apply sanctions in cases of divorce being dragged out, for example. So Mavoi Satum appeals to the Beit Din, and they make an argument saying, because of this halachic precedent, as well as these court cases, this is a case that we can apply sanctions, and the get that would be given under those sanctions is legitimate. So that's what Mavoi Satum and other organizations are doing when they go to the Beit Din to make an argument to the Beit Din. So they're really calling for a more expansive application of halacha, to rely on the precedent and the halachic authorities who expand the cases where you can apply sanctions rather than limit them. So this is kind of a confusing process, so I want to illustrate it with a couple of examples. What I did this summer was I researched cases that Mavoi Satum worked on, and I wrote articles about them. So I want to run through two of the articles I worked on and two of the cases in particular to give an example of how this kind of legal and halachic argumentation plays out. The case on the left, on the 10 years chained article, is pretty unusual, but made like really big news, and it was kind of a high-profile case. The husband refused to give a get for 10 years, and he fled to the U.S. He's currently living in a community in New York. The courts in Israel had been applying sanctions as best as they could, but there's not much they can do from Israel when he's already living in the U.S. and his community in the U.S. had kind of been supporting him and hadn't been applying sanctions. It recently came to light that one of the witnesses at the original wedding between this couple is a pedophile. And Mavoi Satum is arguing that a pedophile cannot be a kosher witness. And so they're going the route of bitul kiddushin, of nullifying the original marriage contract, by saying that because one of the witnesses was a pedophile, the marriage was never valid to begin with. And the couple, she doesn't need a get because the couple isn't even married and they haven't. So that's one case. And that's one strategy that the Beit Din has to end the marriage, is by saying that the marriage was never valid to begin with. The husband has been pleading to the Beit Din that he wants to rehabilitate the marriage, but he hasn't done anything in the past 4 years to show that he's really committed to the marriage. The couple is currently in the process of working with the civil courts to come to a financial arrangement, because if the couple doesn't agree, then the courts will divide up the finances for them. And the husband is asking the wife to accept a financial agreement to end the court process in exchange for the get. So he's blackmailing her by not giving her the get until she accepts a certain financial agreement, which is very, very common. And in this case, Mavoi Satum's role is making an argument to the Beit Din that it's legitimate for them to apply sanctions in this case by relying on the rulings that we saw previously, such as Rabbeinu Yerucham's ruling that in a case where a couple have been separated for a long time, you can apply sanctions. And oh, sorry, I'm just seeing the chat right now. I'm so sorry, I did not. Can we see the slides again later? Yes. Okay, I think I will answer these questions in a moment, but thank you for putting them in the chat, and I'm sorry that I didn't see them until right now. So Mavoi Satum is saying that we can rely on these halachic authorities, such as Rabbeinu Yerucham, such as the Rambam's reading of "He is repulsive to me." Also, Rav Chaim Palagi is one who comes up a lot in these kinds of cases. And we can rely on those halachic authorities, and we can rely on other court cases in which the court did rule according to Rav Chaim Palagi or the Rambam that we can apply sanctions, and the gift that would be given under those sanctions would still be legitimate. Okay, so that's 2 examples of what kind of cases might look like and how Mavoi Satum might respond to them and the techniques that they would use to resolve them. Okay, another thing that Mavoi Satum does is they try to approach the issue from another angle as well, from other angles, I guess, plural. So the first is that they try to reform and improve the government agencies that impact the issue. So, for example, there's a wing of the government called the Agaf Agunot, which literally just means the Agunot wing, whose job it is to track down husbands who don't show up for the court hearings at the Beit Din. So this can happen pretty frequently, which is that one of these spouses just won't show up to the Beit Din, and it can be months and months and months until you have your next hearing. So there's a wing of the government whose job it is to track those people down and make sure that they come. But the way the government is currently structured, this particular office has they're not accountable to anyone. There's no transparency. They have no time commitment constraints. So Mavoi Satum and other organizations like them have recently wrote up this whole document of suggestions for reforming the organization to make them more efficient and effective at what they're trying to do, so that they'll kind of be involved in other government organizations that impact the issue in that way. And another way, which is really huge, is they will advocate for the appointment of judges who will be sympathetic to the cause. Because like we saw, it really comes down to who is on the Beit Din and how that Beit Din is willing to rule. If they're willing to be more expansive in their application of the halachic material or stick to the status quo. So it really comes down to who are the judges on the Beit Din. So I don't know much about how judges are appointed, but insofar as Mavoi Satum is able, they support the appointment of judges who will be likely to rule expansively rather than narrowly. Okay, and luckily, over the past couple of decades, there have been a lot of helpful developments. I call them helpful things because they're kind of various developments. The first is the halachic prenup. I thought I saw in the chat someone mentioned the halachic prenup. I didn't fully read the comment, but I think someone mentioned it. So the halachic prenup is widely accepted by Orthodox authorities in the US and in Israel. And there are a couple different variations of it, like slightly different writings, slightly different authors, but it kind of works the same way, which is to say that if a couple lives apart for a certain amount of time, then large financial penalties are imposed on the party who doesn't give or accept the get. And it's worth noting that the Israeli Beit Din is opposed to using the prenup. Various Israeli Orthodox halachic authorities have endorsed it, but the Beit Din is opposed to using it. They make an argument about how it's needed in the US because the couple might not necessarily go to the Beit Din otherwise, because there's a part of the prenup says that like if you are getting divorced, you like kind of give over authority to the Beit Din to deal with it, to deal with the financial arrangement. And they're saying that in Israel, because everyone has to go to the Beit Din, you don't need the prenup, but it really is more of like a power grab, really. And another technique that can help end cases of sarvanut get is the conditional marriage contract. Mavoi Satum performs private marriages, and they use the conditional marriage in their private marriages. So it relies on the same trigger as the halachic prenup, but it works differently. So the conditional marriage the idea is that the marriage is predicated on the couple not spending significant time apart throughout the whole course of their marriage. So time apart is used as a proxy for the marriage being over. And it's a long time. It's like 15 months it's something like 15 months with certain conditions on those 15 months also. And the idea is that if it comes to happen that the couple spends these 15 consecutive months apart, then it was as though the marriage was never valid to begin with, because the marriage was only valid on the condition that it never came to pass the couple spent 15 consecutive months apart. So it's not that it ends the marriage because the marriage never existed. It's just the clause, the trigger is sort of the thing that you said if it were to happen, and the marriage would never have been valid to begin with. So those are two mechanisms, halachic mechanisms, that can help prevent these cases from happening to begin with. Also, you may have heard of Dr. Rachel Levmore or Professor Rabbi Michael Broid. They've both been involved in writing variations of the prenup and the conditional marriage contract. And public perception is also huge. And public perception in Israel has really become more attuned to the issue. And that comes with more pressure on the judges to comply. And again, like I said, it really comes down to like how the judges are willing to rule. So if the public is applying a lot of pressure to the judges, and the judges, it's in their interest to comply with that public pressure, then they are more likely to rule expansively, which is really what they're being asked to do. And there are also other organizations who work on this. So in Israel, there's Mavoi Satum, who's the organization who I worked for. There's also Yad La'isha, which is affiliated with Or Torah Stone. And there's the Merkaz Tzedek L'Nashim, or the Center for Women's Justice. Those are organizations working in Israel. And then in the US, you may have heard of ORA. They do very similar things as well. Okay. My takeaways from my internship is that most of these cases are sort of normal or average divorce that just got messy in the financial arrangements. The cases that I had heard the most about were the kind of evil cases, but those are really less common than cases of just kind of bitter separation. But so too, those cases of bitter separation, the halachic precedent that you can rely on to apply sanctions is not quite as obvious. But that being said, it is really strong. And I think something that I had been curious about was to what extent organizations like Mavoi Satum are relying on like fringe opinions or doing kind of questionable like loopholes to find arguments for applying sanctions. And they're really not. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means in what's considered like strong halachic precedent, but my perception at least is that the halachic rulings that are being used in the argumentation to apply sanctions are really very strong and very like mainstream halachic authorities. And then the most important part really is who is on the Beit Din, because it ultimately comes down to if the judges are willing to think expansively and apply the halacha to kind of widen the tent of cases in which you can apply sanctions, or stick to the status quo and narrow that the range of cases in which you can apply sanctions. Okay, that is the end. In which case I will stop my share and I think I'll remove my spotlight maybe. And then, okay. I'm gonna look at the chat because I see now that there were questions in the chat and I apologize for not being able to see them earlier. Okay. I see that someone said, since we're not recording, can we see you the slides again later? Yeah, if I'm not entirely sure what that means, but if that's asking to like see the slides now, I can totally pull them back up or send them if that would be helpful as well. Oh, but the presentation is being recorded. Okay. What about a prenup re a get for either party? I'm not entirely sure what that means. Yeah, Janet, could you explain that?
A while back, there was a big push for people getting married in modern Orthodox circles to make sure they had a prenup, so that if for whatever reason the marriage failed, no one will be held up to get the get. And now it's been a while that I really haven't heard anything about it for a long time. And I don't know if that was becoming more common. People are getting these prenups or not getting them, or I don't know if they're getting them here and not in the U.S. versus Israel. I don't know what the story is. So I was curious about that.
Yeah. What I know about the prenup is that I'm pretty sure it's required by the Rabbinical Council of America that any RCA rabbi who's performing a marriage has to use the prenup.
Yeah.
And like I said, in Israel, it's widely endorsed by Orthodox authorities, but the Beit Din opposes using it, and it really seems like they're opposing it just as kind of a power grab, because the prenup would kind of assigns who's going to be in charge of dividing up like finances and kind of dividing up things in cases where it's contested, and they're not assigning that to the Beit Din. So if you use a prenup and you end up getting divorced, the Beit Din no longer has control over your divorce. So that's kind of why they're opposed to it. But it's a good question. And let's see in the chat. Lieberman clause, not sure accepted by Orthodoxy. Was that one of the New York get laws? Was that the Lieberman clause?
This is Shulamit. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I've been told that the Lieberman clause says that if there is a civil divorce that is allowed, then the Jewish marriage is ended. I don't know that it says a lot about settlement or any of that, but it's a Jewish acceptance of a civil agreement. Does that sound possible?
Yes, yeah, definitely. There is the Lieberman clause. I'm not so familiar with it. So I can't speak to that one. New
I'm
York,
not sure it's Orthodox. I'm thinking it's more conservative, liberal rabbis.
that could be. There have been get laws in the state of New York that had similar ideas, where that they linked civil divorce with religious divorce. And I don't know much about them because I mostly know about Israel, but I know that it's kind of a similar mechanism from what you said, where like if you have a civil divorce that is tied to religious divorce, my understanding of the New York get laws is that the state will not give a civil divorce until you've had a religious divorce. It's something like that. And the idea is that it de-incentivizes you to withhold a get because then you can't get a civil divorce. So I think that's probably different than the Lieberman Clause. It sounds like the Lieberman Clause is more on the idea that a civil divorce sort of initiates a religious divorce, or a religious divorce is like not needed after you've had a civil divorce, something along those lines. And I don't know much about that.
I don't know, but I know that, 40 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, in my civil divorce stipulations, it said, this won't be valid unless she gets a get. And so it was enforceable by the state. So not that there was a problem, but I didn't want there to be a problem, so I put it in there. And the only people that care about a get, to be honest, are people who are going to be remarrying in an Orthodox setting. I mean, it becomes moot if the family is liberal. Phyllis?
Yeah, so firstly, I want to welcome Shelley Zach, who I assume
That's my
is
mom.
Holly's mother. Yes?
Yeah,
Welcome.
but she's in California, so I think she's
Yeah,
also sent it.
So my question is, you mentioned that Mavoi Satum is performing private weddings? So
Yes.
are these recognized in the state of Israel?
It's a good question. They're recognized, but they're recognized under various other statuses. So they have a whole like guide to this on their website, which I can send you if you're interested. But they're recognized as like a civil union or a the status is like recognized by the community, something like that. So it's not considered a marriage by the Rabbanut. Like the Rabbanut does not recognize a marriage, but they recognize it as a union that carries with it certain civil, like certain legal benefits.
Is that like a gay
marriage?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear.
I say, is that a common law marriage?
Yes, yes.
Oh,
Oftentimes it's a status of common law marriage. They also will sometimes have people like they'll perform this kind of marriage outside Israel, and then you come back and it's something other than a common law marriage because you were registered elsewhere, something along those lines. But yeah, essentially they do like a common law marriage.
A lot of Israelis that aren't religious will fly to a place like Cyprus and get married in a civil, some kind of civil ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
so I saw a question in chat by Ali's roommates, this great group. They were asking about examples of sanctions that the Beit Din could impose.
It's a good question. So there's actually 4 categories of sanctions, like 4 kind of different rulings that the Beit Din can give that entail different sanctions. So the common sanctions will be like revoking a driver's license, or like not credit cards not working. I don't know exactly what that means, but like cutting off access to their bank account or their driver's license. I don't know exactly which sanctions are allowed by which category. Like one of the categories is like a get is recommended, or a get is required, or a get is encouraged, and each of those categories comes with different sanctions. Jail time is its own status, and I think it's kind of widely not used. Like even in the highest level of sanctions, jail is, for various reasons, has its own like complications. But I think sanctions are mostly financial and kind of civil abilities like driving and voting, things like that. It's a good question though. But you see, like, I think the conversation is often that in like rabbinic times that included like physical violence, but they don't do that, at least publicly or officially anymore. Not that I know of. Oh, and Kalanit, I see that you worked with Mavoi Satum as well. That's cool.
What about the idea of men? It's usually men that don't give get. So what about men that can't get an aliyah or can't get any honors in the community because they're being particularly evil or whatever it is?
And then I think we're on the same wavelength because Tegan just mentioned that very thing right before you said it.
Yeah, I think communities will do that. I don't know how much that can be like mandated per se, but I think that, yeah, I think that's more of a part of some of the sanctions would be social pressure. So you'll like tell the community, and the community will sort of revoke these privileges in their own effort to apply pressure and sanctions. I don't know how much that's like state sanctioned and how much that's tell the community to do what they can and that's what the community will do, but totally. That's done as well.
You were speaking at the, oh, sorry.
Yeah, Joanna.
You were speaking at the beginning about the halachic imbalance. So if women were to refuse versus when men refuse, it's different. Can you speak a little bit more to what that would look like? And it sounds like it's more common for men to refuse, but how that's imbalanced?
Yes, definitely. It's a really good question. So my understanding, and I'm not positive, so there's two ways in which my understanding is that it's imbalanced. The first is that a woman cannot have more than one husband, so she cannot remarry. Men, like biblically, had more than one wife, and they're only prohibited from having more than one wife through a sakana, through like a rabbinic like edict, essentially. So you can also, but that rabbinic edict can be overridden. Like you can be given kind of like an what's that? Like a heter, like permission, I guess, to.
Dispensation might be the right word.
What was it, Phyllis?
Dispensation.
Dispensation. That could be. So a rabbinic court, like a Beit Din, can give a man a dispensation. You give a dispensation so that this edict of not having more than one wife doesn't apply to him, so that he could remarry while still technically being married to his first wife. So that's one imbalance, but that's not an option for women because women have been like biblically prohibited from having more than one husband. The other thing is that a married woman's children are considered mamzerim, and they have this status where they can't like marry Jewish people for 10 generations and can't participate in certain ways. I'm not positive about this, but I'm pretty sure that a married man's children with another person are not considered mamzerim. I'm not positive about that, but that's my understanding. But even if it weren't the case, he can usually get a dispensation to have another wife, and then those children would be not considered mamzerim because they would be considered like legitimate in a given way. So, which is a pretty huge imbalance because the courts will. The edict you can do this. You can give permission for a second wife, but not a second husband.
Wow, thank you. And when you were speaking about the actual divorce, I was thinking like in, I guess, American marriages, their divorce is particularly complicated when there's children involved, with child support and all of the different complexities. Does that play into this? Or is that dealt with differently halachically?
Good question. I don't know about particular halachic like factors for determining child support, but child support would be could potentially be a legal division that might be contested, such that one party might like blackmail the other for a different or legal arrangement of child support or child visitation or custody or things like that. But I don't know of any particular halachic like rules about how you support child support or custody or things like that. But good question. Maybe there are, and I just don't know. And
Hey, anybody else here want to jump in? My chat isn't working. I saw something from Shelley. We'll have to talk another time. It was just on my screen for a minute, but if it, I love your daughter, and I love having her here. So, anybody have other comments? Thank you so much.
yeah, well, I'm wondering for Shulamit asked about the slides. Was there a particular slide that you'd want me to bring back up? It also looks like it's being recorded, so I think Phyllis can send you, or Ruth can send a recording.
Yeah, I asked that at the beginning because there were some that had bullet points and I didn't want to have to write them down now, so I can just go and look at them later.
Right,
Okay.
I hit the record button and I will, with Ollie's permission, be able to upload that to the YouTube Base A website, and it will be
Cool.
available there. I can send the link out.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right.
And then Ruth or Phyllis, were you able to get a picture? And I don't know if people want to
I
black
got-
their screens.
I
if
got
they don't.
several pictures
Oh, Colleen,
at
thank you.
various
Perfect.
times throughout the presentation.
Okay, thank you. My
Well,
Mavoi
I'll email
Satum
those to you.
asked for a picture. And
Okay.
people also, I guess I should ask, are people comfortable if Mavoi Satum posts a picture? I don't know if people's like little face bubbles are in it or not, but
Yes.
you can chat if you are.
I got,
comfortable.
yeah, I got some with people in it, and I got some with just you as the spotlight and your slide behind you. So then
Okay.
you can choose what you want.
Great. So I think Mavoi Satum wants to, publish.
Great.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you for your research.
Appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Ali, and for everyone. Kalani, thank you. Ruth, thank you for the support. And yep, a lot of issues on this topic.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, everyone.
Shavua Tov. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining.